The Battle of Białystok-Minsk, fought from 22nd June to 9th July 1941, emerged as a critical engagement during the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Its origins were rooted in the broader strategic calculus of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as Europe entered its third year of war. Following the fall of France in June 1940 and the successful Balkan campaigns in the spring of 1941, Adolf Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for a rapid and decisive campaign in the east, aiming to destroy the Red Army west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers and seize key industrial and political centers before winter. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tasked with delivering the main blow, advancing through Belarus towards Smolensk and Moscow. Its spearhead would strike the Soviet Western Front, commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov, whose forces, concentrated around Białystok, Grodno, and Minsk, formed a forward-deployed bulge vulnerable to encirclement. Germany's strategic motivations centered on destroying Soviet combat power through a series of encirclements rather than prolonged positional fighting. Army Group Center fielded approximately 1.3 million men, organized into 51 divisions, including 9 panzer and 6 motorized divisions. Its 2 armored groups, Panzer Group 2 under General Heinz Guderian and Panzer Group 3 under General Hermann Hoth, contained over 1,700 tanks, primarily Panzer III and Ivo models, supported by nearly 2,500 aircraft from Luftflotte 2 under Albert Kesselring. Their task was to penetrate Soviet lines rapidly, encircle Red Army forces in the Białystok-Minsk sector, and continue the drive toward Smolensk. German intelligence, based on aerial reconnaissance and captured communications, assessed Soviet forces as numerous but poorly coordinated, with limited operational reserves positioned in depth. The Soviet Western Front, defending the approaches to Minsk and Smolensk, comprised roughly 625,000 personnel, including 44 rifle divisions, 20 tank and motorized divisions, and over 10,000 artillery pieces. Its armored strength, while numerically larger at around 3,300 tanks, consisted heavily of obsolete models such as the T-26 and BT series, with only a few hundred newer T-34s and KV-1s concentrated in mechanized corps. Soviet air strength in the region totaled about 1,500 aircraft, but many were deployed to forward airfields and vulnerable to Luftwaffe strikes. The Red Army's forward posture, dictated by pre-war plans to disrupt any German offensive near the frontier, placed its forces at risk of envelopment. Intelligence warnings of German preparations were numerous but inconsistently acted upon, with Soviet leadership reluctant to believe a full-scale invasion would begin, while negotiations with Germany were ongoing. Public sentiment on the Soviet side, shaped by government propaganda, portrayed the border deployments as a deterrent and a shield for Belarus and the Western USSR. However, the Red Army's rapid expansion following the annexation of eastern Poland and the Baltic states in 1939-1940 had left many formations under strength, inadequately trained, and lacking in logistical infrastructure. Ammunition, fuel, and spare parts were often stockpiled far from the front, while communications between headquarters and divisions relied on vulnerable telephone lines. German forces, by contrast, benefited from a year of operational experience and logistical refinement, with rail conversion units and motorized supply columns prepared to sustain a rapid advance across Belarus. By late June 1941, both sides had concentrated substantial forces along the Belarusian frontier, but with starkly different levels of readiness and deployment. Army Group Center's plan relied on speed and coordination to envelop the Soviet Western Front in 2 massive pockets near Białystok and Minsk, destroying Soviet combat power west of the Dnieper in less than 3 weeks. The Soviet command, though aware of the risk of encirclement, lacked the mobility and reserves to reorganize before the German offensive commenced. The stage was set for a campaign that, in just over 2 weeks, would see the near destruction of Pavlov's forces, the fall of Minsk, and the opening of the road to Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. The German invasion of the Soviet Union began on 22nd of June 1941 with a coordinated assault along a 1,800-kilometer front, and for Army Group Center, the offensive opened with a concentrated strike across the Bug and Neman rivers into Belarus. At dawn, Luftwaffe 2 launched mass air raids against Soviet airfields, destroying over 600 aircraft within hours, crippling the Western Front's ability to contest air superiority. Simultaneously, artillery barrages and rapid armored thrusts by Panzer Group 2 advancing from the Brest area toward Slonim, and Panzer Group 3 striking north of Grodno toward Lida and Vilnius, targeted the flanks of General Dmitry Pavlov's forward-deployed forces around Białystok. These movements aimed to encircle Soviet armies by converging near Volkovysk and Baranovichi, while infantry armies followed to seal the encirclement and eliminate trapped forces. On the Soviet side, the Western Front's command structure was slow to react. General Pavlov, headquartered in Minsk, received fragmented reports of Luftwaffe strikes and panzer breakthroughs, but hesitated to authorize large-scale withdrawals, fearing accusations of defeatism and lacking coherent intelligence on German main efforts. Soviet mechanized corps, including the 6th, 11th, and 13th, were ordered into counterattacks along the Grodno and Brest axes on 23–24 June, committing nearly 1,500 tanks in piecemeal engagements. Many of these formations, equipped with outdated T-26 and BT tanks, advanced without adequate fuel or infantry support, suffering heavy losses to German 88mm guns, Stuka dive bombers, and Panzer III and IV units. By 25 June, several corps had lost more than 50% of their vehicles, with some formations reduced to scattered remnants retreating eastward. The speed of the German advance outpaced Soviet attempts at coordination. By 24 June, Panzer Group 3 had captured Vilnius and was pushing toward Molodechno, cutting the main highway between Kaunas and Minsk, while Panzer Group 2 had crossed the Shara River and was advancing toward Slutsk. Infantry divisions of the 4th and 9th Armies moved steadily behind the panzers, consolidating gains and engaging Soviet rifle divisions holding fortified lines near Grodno and Brest. Luftwaffe dominance, with over 1,500 sorties per day, further hampered Soviet efforts to regroup or launch organized counterattacks, as supply columns, troop concentrations, and retreating units were repeatedly targeted along the few operational roads. Civilian populations in western Belarus were immediately affected by the rapid escalation. Cities such as Grodno and Brest experienced heavy bombing, resulting in thousands of civilian casualties and triggering mass evacuations eastward. Transport networks became congested with refugees, retreating Soviet forces, and supply convoys, contributing to the collapse of orderly movement for the Western Front. Many Soviet administrative and industrial personnel attempted to evacuate equipment and archives, but the speed of the German advance left much of the region's infrastructure and stockpiles to be captured or destroyed. By 26 June, the initial phase of the encirclement was taking shape. Panzer Group 3 reached the Molodechno area north of Minsk, while Panzer Group 2 closed in from the south via Slonim and Baranovichi. The Soviet 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies, totaling over 300,000 troops, were increasingly threatened with encirclement west of Minsk. Soviet High Command, recognizing the crisis, ordered desperate breakout attempts and the formation of ad hoc defensive lines along the Berezina River. But the pace of the German advance, combined with the loss of coherent command and control, left most of these efforts fragmented. The Western Front, still struggling to communicate with Moscow, was now on the verge of a large-scale encirclement, with the road to Minsk and ultimately Smolensk already opening for Army Group Center's advancing divisions. The planning that shaped the encirclement west of Minsk reflected contrasting priorities and capabilities on the German and Soviet sides. For Army Group Center, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and his subordinate commanders, particularly Heinz Guderian of Panzer Group 2 and Hermann Hoth of Panzer Group 3, pushed to exploit the momentum gained in the first 72 hours of Operation Barbarossa. Their objective was to close a double envelopment around the Soviet 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies, which were still concentrated in the Białystok salient, by linking their armored spearheads east of Slonim and near Molodechno. Panzer Group 2, driving north from Brest, fielded approximately 600 operational tanks and motorized infantry, while Panzer Group 3, advancing south from Vilnius, deployed around 700 tanks. Both groups were supported by Luftflotte 2, which had flown over 6,000 sorties between 22 and 27 June, ensuring near-total air superiority and striking Soviet troop movements, rail hubs, and supply columns. The supporting infantry armies, the German 4th and 9th, advanced behind the panzers, consolidating captured territory and reducing isolated Soviet strongpoints. These armies, together with corps-level artillery and logistics, ensured the encirclement could be tightened and sustained. German supply lines, though extended, were maintained through captured Soviet rail networks, rapidly converted to standard gauge by railway engineering units, and by the organized use of motorized columns ferrying fuel and ammunition from depots in East Prussia and Poland. This logistical system, refined during the campaigns in France and the Balkans, enabled German armored and motorized divisions to sustain their forward thrusts despite the rapid pace of the advance. The Soviet Western Front, under General Dmitry Pavlov, struggled to formulate a coherent response. Stavka's instructions emphasized holding positions and counterattacking rather than conducting organized withdrawals, despite the risk of envelopment. Pavlov's remaining mechanized corps, already battered from failed counteroffensives near Grodno and Brest, were ordered to regroup near Slonim and Baranovichi to cover the retreat of infantry formations. However, shortages of fuel, the loss of functioning radios, and the destruction of forward supply dumps left these units combat ineffective. Tank losses exceeded 800 vehicles by 28 June, with many abandoned for lack of fuel or mechanical failure rather than combat damage. Infantry divisions, lacking motor transport, retreated piecemeal on foot, making it impossible to outpace the advancing German armor. Propaganda and morale played roles during this stage, though with differing effects. German broadcasts and leaflets celebrated the encirclement's progress, emphasizing the destruction of Soviet forces as evidence of a rapidly approaching victory. Among German troops, morale remained high, bolstered by tangible successes and relatively light casualties compared to the scale of Soviet losses. On the Soviet side, internal communications downplayed the scale of the crisis, but soldiers in the threatened armies witnessed the collapse firsthand. Roads clogged with retreating columns, burned out vehicles, and disrupted chains of command. Desertion and disorganization became common, as some units attempted independent breakouts, while others dug in along improvised defensive positions, hoping for relief that never arrived. Misjudgments compounded the Soviet predicament. Pavlov underestimated the speed of the German armored thrusts and believed his armies could regroup along the Berezina and Svislach rivers before being cut off. Stavka, hesitant to authorize a full withdrawal, delayed until the situation had become irreversible. German commanders, meanwhile, balanced speed with encirclement security, deploying motorized infantry and elements of the 20th Panzer Division to block potential Soviet escape routes, while the 18th and 47th Panzer Corps tightened the southern and northern jaws of the pocket. By 28 June, the operational framework of the encirclement was nearly complete. German spearheads from Panzer Group 2 captured Baranovichi and pressed north, while Panzer Group 3's advance units reached the approaches to Molodechno. The jaws of the encirclement were set to close east of Slonim. The next days would determine whether the Soviet forces could mount a coordinated breakout, or whether Army Group Center would achieve the destruction of the Western Front as planned, clearing the path to Minsk and beyond. The first major engagements within the tightening Białystok-Minsk pocket unfolded between 28 June and 1 July 1941 as the Soviet 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies, collectively numbering over 300,000 men, attempted to resist encirclement or break free before the German armored pincers could seal the gap. The German 18th Panzer Division, advancing from Baranovichi, and elements of the 7th Panzer Division driving south from Molodechno, met near Lida on 28 June, effectively cutting the primary eastward escape routes along the Molodechno-Minsk highway. Simultaneously, the German 20th Panzer Division, supported by motorized infantry from the 29th and 17th Divisions, established blocking positions along the Berezina crossings, preventing Soviet remnants from withdrawing toward Minsk. This maneuver completed the inner ring of the encirclement, while infantry divisions from the German 4th and 9th Armies formed an outer ring to repel any Soviet counteroffensives from outside the pocket. Inside the pocket, Soviet command structures rapidly deteriorated. Communications between Pavlov's Western Front headquarters and his field armies were sporadic, with most divisions reliant on runners or captured civilian telephones as radio networks failed. Several mechanized corps, including the 6th and 11th, reduced to fewer than 50 operational tanks each, attempted localized counterattacks near Slonim and Baranovichi, hoping to delay the German advance and open corridors for infantry withdrawal. These efforts met with heavy losses as German anti-tank units and Luftwaffe Stuka squadrons concentrated on neutralizing the remaining armored threats. By 30 June, many Soviet formations were fragmented into isolated groups of battalion and regimental strength, retreating east through forests and marshes, rather than along the roads now controlled by German motorized columns. Civilian populations within the encircled region faced immediate turmoil. Towns such as Lida, Novogrudok, and Baranovichi, caught between retreating Soviet troops and advancing German forces, suffered artillery bombardments and airstrikes, leading to thousands of civilian casualties and widespread destruction of infrastructure. Evacuation efforts collapsed as transport assets were commandeered by retreating military units, leaving many residents stranded. Food and medical supplies became scarce, prompting looting and the emergence of small bands of armed civilians attempting to secure provisions in the chaos. For the German forces, the challenge shifted from rapid advance to containing and reducing a massive pocket. Supply lines stretching back to Poland and East Prussia were strained as fuel, ammunition, and rations had to be distributed to fast-moving panzer divisions and the slower infantry formations engaged in sealing the encirclement. Railway repair units worked continuously to convert Soviet broad-gauge lines, while horse-drawn and motorized columns bridged the gap in the interim. German commanders, aware of the importance of annihilating the trapped Soviet armies quickly, pressed their infantry forward to compress the pocket, while panzers were ready to pivot east toward Minsk once the reduction was complete. Morale within the encircled Soviet armies fluctuated between desperation and determination. Some units, particularly elements of the 10th Army, launched night assaults against the German cordon, exploiting gaps between infantry regiments to escape in small groups. Others entrenched in forested areas, preparing to fight until reinforcements or relief from outside arrived. Stavka, however, was unable to organize any significant external counteroffensive, as other Soviet fronts were also under severe pressure, leaving the trapped armies largely isolated. By 1 July, the Soviet forces inside the Białystok-Minsk pocket were compressed into an area roughly 40 kilometers across, with diminishing supplies and no effective coordination. German infantry divisions began methodically advancing from all sides, supported by artillery barrages and close air support, breaking the remaining Soviet defensive lines into scattered pockets of resistance. The battle shifted from mobile operations to the grim process of systematically eliminating surrounded units, as Army Group Center prepared to complete the destruction of Pavlov's Western Front and advance unopposed toward Minsk. From 1 to 4 July 1941, the fighting within the Białystok-Minsk encirclement intensified as German infantry and motorized formations moved to systematically reduce the pocket. The trapped Soviet forces, primarily the remnants of the 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies, numbering around 300,000 at the onset of the encirclement, were now compressed into a tightening area between Slonim, Baranovichi, and Novogrudok. With ammunition, food, and medical supplies running low and command structures fragmented, many Soviet divisions devolved into isolated groups, fighting independently or attempting breakout maneuvers under cover of night. German infantry divisions from the 4th and 9th Armies, supported by elements of the 20th Panzer Division and Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers, attacked from all sides, shrinking the pocket daily by 5 to 10 kilometers. Breakout attempts became the primary focus for Soviet troops. On the nights of 2 and 3 July, large-scale efforts were launched by elements of the 10th Army near Baranovichi and by fragmented mechanized corps south of Novogrudok. These assaults, often conducted without artillery preparation due to ammunition shortages, achieved temporary breaches in the German lines but were quickly countered by reserves, including motorized infantry and anti-tank detachments. Casualties from these efforts were heavy, with entire regiments annihilated by German machine gun fire and artillery as they attempted to cross open terrain. Only small groups, often numbering a few dozen soldiers, managed to slip through to the east, with most of the trapped formations forced back into the pocket. German logistical efforts became increasingly strained as the operation progressed. The rapid advance of Panzer Groups 2 and 3 had extended supply lines deep into Belarus, and the need to maintain fuel and ammunition for ongoing operations toward Minsk and beyond competed with the requirements of the encirclement battles. Horse-drawn transport and captured Soviet vehicles supplemented German motorized columns, while engineers worked to repair bridges and roads damaged by retreating Soviet forces in the spring rains. Despite these challenges, the methodical approach of the infantry divisions ensured that the reduction of the pocket continued at a steady pace, allowing the panzer divisions to remain largely uncommitted so they could refocus on the drive east once the encirclement was complete. Civilian populations trapped within the pocket endured severe hardships. Towns and villages caught in the crossfire were subject to bombardment, looting, and the requisition of supplies by both retreating Soviet troops and advancing German forces. Thousands of civilians attempted to flee eastward alongside Soviet soldiers, often becoming targets for German aircraft as they crowded the roads. The destruction of railways and roads, combined with the collapse of organized evacuation efforts, left much of the local population stranded in devastated settlements or hiding in surrounding forests, dependent on scavenged food and makeshift shelters. For the Soviet High Command, the situation grew increasingly dire. Communications with the encircled armies were largely lost, leaving Stavka unable to coordinate a concerted relief operation. Efforts to form defensive lines along the Berezina and Dnieper rivers to slow the German advance proceeded in parallel, but these offered no immediate aid to the trapped forces. General Pavlov's inability to extract his armies or stabilize the front drew scrutiny from Moscow, and by 4th July, the NKVD had begun investigations into the collapse, with accusations of incompetence and defeatism directed at senior commanders. By the end of 4th July, the encircled Soviet forces had been compressed into an area of less than 25 kilometers across, surrounded by a ring of German infantry and artillery, with Luftwaffe aircraft continuously targeting any movement within the pocket. The remnants of the Western Front were reduced to scattered battalions and small groups of soldiers, many lacking heavy weapons or coherent leadership. The stage was set for the final destruction of these forces over the following days, as Army Group Center prepared to declare the pocket cleared and redirect its full strength toward Minsk, Smolensk, and the next phase of the advance toward Moscow. Between 5 and 9 July 1941, the Białystok-Minsk pocket was systematically eliminated as German infantry, supported by artillery and air power, crushed the remaining Soviet forces trapped west of Minsk. At the start of this phase, approximately 250,000 Soviet troops, drawn from the remnants of the 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies, remained encircled in a shrinking area around Novogrudok and Baranovichi. Many of these units had been reduced to fragments, with divisions numbering only a few hundred combat-effective soldiers, lacking coordinated command, artillery, or logistical support. The German 4th and 9th Armies, deploying over 20 infantry divisions supported by corps-level artillery and engineers, advanced inward from all directions, while the Luftwaffe maintained continuous pressure with Stuka dive bombers targeting Soviet strongpoints, troop concentrations, and attempted escape routes. The artillery barrages preceded each advance, forcing Soviet defenders out of fortified positions and forest cover, while engineers cleared minefields and obstacles. When resistance stiffened, close air support was called in to neutralize Soviet strongpoints before infantry closed in. Soviet breakout attempts continued during this stage, primarily in small groups rather than coordinated mass assaults. On the night of 6 July, remnants of several rifle divisions attempted to break through near Baranovichi, but German blocking forces, including elements of the 29th Motorized Infantry Division and attached anti-tank units, repelled these efforts with concentrated fire, inflicting heavy casualties. Only scattered survivors managed to escape to the east, most without equipment. Conditions for the encircled Soviet soldiers deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition stocks were almost exhausted, many heavy weapons had been abandoned or destroyed, and rations had run out. Water supplies were often contaminated due to the destruction of infrastructure and the accumulation of unburied dead across the battle zone, contributing to outbreaks of disease among the trapped troops. Many soldiers resorted to foraging for food in abandoned villages or forests, further reducing their combat effectiveness. Morale collapsed, with entire groups surrendering to German forces rather than continuing futile resistance. German infantry units, tasked with processing large numbers of prisoners, began establishing improvised holding camps near Baranovichi and Slonim to manage the influx. German logistical demands eased slightly as the pocket's size diminished. With fewer combat operations elsewhere in the sector, supplies could be concentrated on the reduction effort, allowing for steady artillery bombardments and resupply of advancing units. The panzer divisions of Groups 2 and 3, having completed their encirclement role, were withdrawn to refit and prepare for the next offensive towards Smolensk. Their absence left the final fighting to the infantry, who moved systematically, clearing forested areas, occupying villages, and destroying any remaining organized Soviet positions. For the civilian population still trapped within the pocket, the closing days of the battle were marked by devastation. Many villages were burned during the fighting or abandoned entirely, and thousands of civilians were swept up in the chaos, either following retreating Soviet troops eastward or falling into German custody alongside the soldiers. Food and shelter were virtually non-existent, forcing many to rely on scavenged resources until the fighting ended. German authorities began organizing temporary collection points for civilians, though most were left to fend for themselves as priority was given to managing the massive number of captured Soviet troops. By 9 July, organized Soviet resistance in the pocket had effectively ceased. German forces reported the capture of over 290,000 prisoners, along with 3,300 tanks and armored vehicles, and more than 800 artillery pieces, though many of these were abandoned and inoperable. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed during the fighting, with only small numbers managing to escape east in disorganized groups. The destruction of the Soviet Western Front west of Minsk cleared the way for Army Group Center to resume its drive toward Smolensk, marking the end of one of the largest encirclement battles of the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. After the collapse of organized Soviet resistance west of Minsk, the German forces shifted from combat operations to consolidating control over the captured territory and reorganizing for the continued advance toward Smolensk. The infantry divisions of the German 4th and 9th Armies remained in the Białystok-Minsk area through mid-July 1941, tasked with securing prisoners, salvaging usable equipment, and clearing the battlefield of obstacles and debris left by the fighting. With nearly 300,000 captured Soviet troops to manage, German command established multiple temporary prisoner collection points near Baranovichi, Slonim, and Minsk, before transferring large groups to railheads for transport to holding camps in Poland and East Prussia. These facilities, hastily assembled, were overcrowded and undersupplied, contributing to significant mortality from hunger, exposure, and disease among the captured soldiers even before they reached permanent camps. The reduction of the pocket also yielded substantial material captures. German recovery units documented approximately 3,300 Soviet tanks and armored vehicles, though the majority were destroyed, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or rendered inoperable for lack of fuel. More than 1,800 artillery pieces and tens of thousands of small arms were seized, along with ammunition stockpiles and supplies left in depots and along retreat routes. German engineers worked to recover usable materiel, repurposing captured vehicles for transport or repair, while scrapping damaged equipment to clear roads and rail lines. Rail repair battalions accelerated the conversion of Soviet broad-gauge tracks, enabling supplies to flow forward in preparation for the Smolensk operation. For the Red Army, the immediate aftermath was defined by chaos and a desperate effort to rebuild shattered formations. Of the more than 600,000 troops deployed in the Western Front at the start of Operation Barbarossa, nearly half were dead, captured, or dispersed by mid-July. Surviving units withdrew to defensive lines along the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, where Stavka attempted to establish a new defensive belt with the remnants of the Western Front and reinforcements arriving from the interior. However, many of these regroup formations were under strength, with divisions averaging 3,000–4,000 men instead of their authorized 14,000, and lacking heavy weapons or vehicles. Stavka began transferring fresh rifle divisions from the Urals and Siberia to stabilize the central sector, but these reinforcements would not reach full strength before Army Group Center resumed its offensive. The psychological toll of the encirclement was significant for both sides. Among Soviet troops, morale suffered as stories of the pocket's destruction spread through retreating units, leading to heightened desertion rates and reluctance to hold forward positions along the Dnieper. Soviet propaganda minimized the scale of the losses, emphasizing the need to delay the German advance, but soldiers who had escaped the encirclement described the near-total destruction of their armies, eroding confidence in the command structure. For German soldiers, the victory bolstered morale and reinforced confidence in the Blitzkrieg doctrine. Reports circulated highlighting the destruction of entire Soviet armies with relatively low German losses, estimated at fewer than 15,000 casualties for Army Group Center during the operation, which reinforced expectations of a rapid and decisive campaign in the east. Civilian populations in Belarus faced a new reality as German occupation authorities began asserting control. Military administrators requisitioned food, livestock, and labor to support Army Group Centers' operations, while displaced civilians from the battle zone were often left without organized aid. Many were relocated or compelled to work repairing infrastructure damaged during the fighting. Villages devastated by the battle became temporary billets for German units, while others were cleared to make way for supply depots and staging areas. The destruction of transport networks and farmland compounded shortages, leaving much of the civilian population dependent on improvised subsistence measures. By mid-July, the Białystok-Minsk sector had transitioned from active combat to a logistical hub for the next phase of Operation Barbarossa. The panzer divisions of Groups 2 and 3 refitted and resupplied, redeployed eastward, while the infantry divisions completed clearance and occupation duties before preparing to advance. The Soviet Western Front, now effectively destroyed as an operational entity, was in the process of reconstitution, but its ability to mount a cohesive defense remained limited. The road to Smolensk lay open, with Army Group Center positioned to exploit its success and drive deeper into Soviet territory. As Army Group Center completed the occupation of the Białystok-Minsk region, the operational balance shifted toward the preparation for the next major objective, the Smolensk Axis, the gateway to Moscow. Between mid and late July 1941, German forces consolidated their gains and redeployed for continued offensive operations, while the Soviet High Command rushed to reconstruct defensive lines and organize countermeasures with the remnants of its shattered forces. The destruction of the Soviet Western Front had left a gap exceeding 300 kilometers in depth between the new German front line near Minsk and the hastily forming Soviet positions along the Dnieper River. This open corridor presented both opportunity and risk for the advancing Wehrmacht, which now needed to stabilize its logistics while sustaining operational momentum. German armored units, including Panzer Groups 2 and 3, began refitting after their role in the Encirclement. These two groups, which had fielded roughly 300 tanks at the start of the campaign, reported operational strengths of around 900 by mid-July due to combat losses and mechanical attrition. Workshops worked continuously to repair disabled vehicles, while replacement tanks from Germany were dispatched to replenish depleted units. Panzer and motorized divisions redeployed eastward in staggered movements, ensuring that supply convoys and repair battalions could maintain pace. Rail conversion units accelerated their efforts, extending standard gauge lines deeper into Belarus, as fuel, ammunition, and rations had to be stockpiled near Minsk before any renewed offensive could begin. The Soviet response focused on erecting a new defensive belt along the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, anchored by Smolensk to the northeast and Orsha to the southeast. Stavka reorganized surviving elements of the 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies into provisional rifle divisions, many numbering only a fraction of their authorized strength. Fresh divisions from the interior, including formations from the Volga and Siberian districts, were deployed to bolster these positions, bringing total Soviet strength in the central sector to approximately 400,000 troops by late July. However, these forces were short on heavy weapons, with fewer than 400 operational tanks and limited artillery support, much of which consisted of older, short-range guns. Supply lines running from Moscow and Gorky struggled to deliver sufficient ammunition and fuel, as the rail networks east of the Dnieper became congested with retreating formations and arriving reinforcements. For German planners, the destruction of the Soviet Western Front validated the blitzkrieg approach but also raised concerns. Intelligence reports noted that despite the heavy Soviet losses, fresh reserves continued to arrive, and the Red Army showed no signs of seeking negotiations. Logistical officers cautioned that the pace of the advance had already pushed Army Group Center's supply lines to their limits, with critical shortages of fuel threatening to delay operations if rail and road infrastructure were not secured and expanded. Furthermore, partisan activity began to surface in the forests and marshes around Baranovichi and Minsk, as Soviet soldiers who had escaped the pocket joined by local civilians, launched small-scale ambushes and sabotage missions against German supply convoys. Morale diverged sharply between the two armies. German soldiers, buoyed by the massive victory west of Minsk and low casualty rates relative to the scale of success, anticipated a rapid continuation of the campaign, with many convinced that Moscow could be reached before autumn. Soviet troops, while demoralized by the destruction of their comrades, began to rally around defensive preparations, encouraged by political commissars and propaganda emphasizing the necessity of holding the Dnieper line to protect Moscow. Stavka issued strict orders for no further retreats, with threats of severe punishment for unauthorized withdrawals, while simultaneously attempting to improve coordination between new arrivals and surviving units. The civilian situation in Belarus deteriorated further during this transitional phase. German occupation policies included the requisition of agricultural output and the forced relocation of able-bodied civilians to labor battalions, many assigned to road repair and railway reconstruction to support the advancing Wehrmacht. Food shortages intensified as local harvests were diverted to the German army, leading to widespread malnutrition among the remaining population. Soviet partisans seeking to disrupt German control began recruiting from among these displaced civilians, further destabilizing the region. By the final week of July 1941, the aftermath of the Białystok-Minsk encirclement had created a new strategic dynamic. German forces, though victorious, were preparing for another rapid drive while grappling with the demands of extended supply lines and rising partisan threats. The Soviets, despite catastrophic losses, had managed to assemble a new defensive network, though understrength and ill-equipped. The destruction of the Western Front had opened the road to Smolensk, but the conditions suggested that the next phase would not be as swift or as unopposed as the breakthrough in Belarus. By early August 1941, the consequences of the Białystok-Minsk battle continued to shape operations for both the German and Soviet commands as the focus shifted toward the Smolensk front. Army Group Center, despite its success in eliminating the Soviet Western Front and capturing over 300,000 prisoners, now faced the challenge of sustaining momentum across a deepening logistical gap. The panzer divisions of Groups 2 and 3, which had spearheaded the encirclement, were preparing to drive toward Roslavel and Smolensk, but reported declining readiness. Fewer than 850 operational tanks remained from their initial 1,300, with many vehicles awaiting repairs or replacement. Fuel shortages became a recurring problem, as rail conversion toward Minsk and beyond had not yet caught up with the forward position of the panzers, forcing reliance on long, vulnerable truck convoys. German infantry divisions, having borne the primary burden of reducing the Białystok-Minsk pocket, remained engaged in securing the region and preparing for the eastward advance. Several divisions were tasked with occupation duties, guarding prisoner columns, and countering growing partisan activity in the forests and marshes west of Minsk. Reports of ambushes and sabotage by Soviet stragglers and local fighters became more frequent, prompting the establishment of security zones along key roads and railways. These rear-area operations consumed manpower that might otherwise have reinforced the spearheads, delaying the concentration of full strength for the next major offensive. On the Soviet side, Stavka moved rapidly to replace the shattered Western Front with a newly designated Reserve Front and a reorganized Central Front, drawing reinforcements from the Moscow Military District and beyond. By the first week of August, approximately 400,000 troops, organized into rifle divisions, mechanized brigades, and artillery units, had been deployed along the Dnieper and around Smolensk. Many of these divisions were under strength, with battalions numbering 300-400 men instead of 600-800, and lacking sufficient motor transport or modern equipment. Fewer than 500 tanks were available, mostly older T-26 and BT models, with only a few dozen T-34s and KV-1s arriving from factories east of the Urals. Despite these limitations, Soviet command emphasized delaying tactics and the establishment of fortified zones to buy time for further mobilization and industrial evacuation. The fighting in Belarus had displaced hundreds of thousands, with more than 100,000 civilians streaming east towards Smolensk and Moscow or hiding in the countryside. German occupation authorities requisitioned grain, livestock, and labor for military use, further deepening shortages. Many able-bodied men were conscripted into forced labor battalions to repair railways and roads, while women and children scavenged to survive. Partisan bands formed from displaced civilians and retreating soldiers began conducting raids on German convoys and communication lines, forcing the Wehrmacht to divert combat units to rear area security. Strategically, both sides assessed their positions with caution. German planners debated the pace of the advance. Some, including Heinz Guderian, advocated pushing rapidly toward Moscow before the Soviets could reinforce, while others urged consolidating supply lines and securing the flanks, particularly with reports of Soviet counterattacks emerging around Smolensk and Yelnya. The High Command aimed to capitalize on the destruction of the Soviet Western Front by striking before the Red Army could fully reorganize, but recognized that the operational conditions were shifting away from the fast-paced encirclements of June and July toward more contested battles. Soviet leadership, while acknowledging the catastrophic losses of June and July, viewed the stabilization of a defensive line as an opportunity to blunt the German momentum. Reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East, though not yet in position, were expected to bolster these lines by late August. Political commissars intensified efforts to restore morale among surviving units, emphasizing the defense of Moscow as critical to the survival of the state. Orders from Stalin and Stavka prohibited unauthorized withdrawals, with severe penalties for officers and soldiers who abandoned their positions. By the second week of August, the Białystok-Minsk battle had transitioned from an active engagement into a strategic foundation for the next phase of the campaign. The German forces held the approaches to Smolensk and had secured Belarus, but their forward momentum was tempered by logistical strain, partisan threats, and the necessity of reorganizing for sustained operations. The Soviet Red Army, though badly mauled, was no longer in disarray and had begun to establish a cohesive defense that would force Army Group Center into a more grinding and prolonged campaign. The encirclement west of Minsk had opened the road to Moscow, but it had also signaled that the campaign in the east would not end as quickly as German planners had anticipated. The aftermath of the Białystok-Minsk battle shaped the course of the Eastern Front through the remainder of the summer of 1941, leaving lasting operational, strategic, and human consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. For Army Group Center, the destruction of the Soviet Western Front was a decisive tactical success, eliminating more than 300,000 enemy soldiers, capturing or destroying approximately 3,300 tanks and 1,800 artillery pieces, and securing Belarus, including the key logistical hub of Minsk. Yet this victory also brought new challenges. The speed and depth of the advance, extending more than 600 kilometers from the German frontier, placed immense strain on supply networks. Rail conversion lagged behind the panzer spearheads, forcing reliance on truck convoys vulnerable to breakdown and partisan attacks. Fuel shortages and mechanical wear reduced the number of operational tanks in Panzer Groups 2 and 3 to fewer than 900 by early August, limiting the tempo of operations as the Wehrmacht prepared to advance on Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. For the Soviet Union, the destruction of its forward armies marked one of the gravest losses in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. The loss of over 300,000 troops, combined with the near-total collapse of the Western Front's command structure, forced Stavka to dismantle and reconstitute its central defense. Surviving fragments of the 3rd, 4th, and 10th Armies were reorganized into provisional rifle divisions, while reinforcements from Siberia, the Urals, and the Volga region were rushed to establish new defensive lines along the Dnieper and Dvina rivers. Despite these efforts, most divisions remained under strength, averaging 3,000 to 4,000 men, lacking modern equipment, and relying heavily on hastily fortified positions. The industrial evacuation of factories from Belarus and Western Russia accelerated in the wake of the defeat, as Soviet planners prepared for the possibility of a further German breakthrough toward Moscow. Civilian populations in Belarus endured widespread devastation. The encirclement battles had displaced hundreds of thousands, with more than 100,000 civilians fleeing eastward toward Smolensk and Moscow. Those who remained faced occupation policies that included the requisition of food and livestock, forced labor, and the destruction of entire villages deemed obstacles to German logistics. Malnutrition and disease spread rapidly as supply networks prioritized the Wehrmacht over the civilian populace. Meanwhile, partisan resistance began to take shape, as armed civilians and escaped Soviet soldiers organized ambushes and sabotage operations in forests and marshes, marking the start of a growing insurgency that would complicate German control throughout the occupied territories. The psychological impact of the battle reverberated through both armies. German soldiers, emboldened by the scale of the victory and relatively low casualties compared to Soviet losses, expected the campaign to culminate with a swift capture of Moscow before autumn. This confidence influenced high command decisions, encouraging continued deep advances despite logistical warnings. Conversely, Soviet troops and civilians, though shaken by the defeat, hardened their resolve as propaganda emphasized the necessity of defending the heartland. Political commissars enforced strict discipline, with orders from Stalin threatening severe punishment for unauthorized withdrawals, even as Stavka focused on stabilizing the front and buying time for reinforcements and industrial relocation. Historically, the Białystok-Minsk encirclement became emblematic of the early Barbarossa campaign, a demonstration of the Wehrmacht's operational effectiveness and the Red Army's initial vulnerability, but also an early indication of the challenges Germany would face in sustaining a war of such scale. While the victory opened the road to Smolensk and paved the way for the eventual Battle of Moscow, it also highlighted the logistical constraints and attrition that would slow Army Group Center's advance. For the Soviet Union, the defeat was catastrophic, yet it did not break its capacity to resist. The rapid reconstitution of defensive forces and the mobilization of industrial and human resources underscored the resilience that would define the later stages of the war. In retrospect, the battle's legacy lies not only in its immediate tactical results, but in its broader consequences for the trajectory of the Eastern Front. It demonstrated that while German forces could achieve large-scale encirclements and inflict massive losses, the destruction of one Soviet front was insufficient to compel surrender or prevent the re-establishment of defenses. For the Red Army, it became a case study in the dangers of forward deployment and inadequate mobility, shaping future defensive strategies. The road to Warsaw and Moscow was opened by the encirclement west of Minsk, but the costs and complications it revealed foreshadowed the protracted and brutal campaign that would follow.